There's a lot to say, and I think I will very much like your questions to kind of structure and see what direction you really want to take this evening in. But I decided to begin my presentation this evening with where I was last September 2014. I was together with 9 other young Jewish activists, thinkers, academics at a program called Beit Machshava, which was a very small retreat for about 1 week. And the goal of the retreat was to discuss European affairs from a Jewish perspective. One of the outcomes of the retreat and of our little project was something called the Glemstad Declaration. Glemstad was the name of this small Swedish island in the Stockholm archipelago. Part of the declaration was a very strong affirmation that Jewish life in Europe is far, far more than fighting anti-Semitism, fighting all kinds of hate, being on the defense. In this declaration, we as young Jews wanted to remind ourselves of the good stuff, of what made it great to be part of a Jewish community, of a Jewish student union, of, to be happy and excited about learning. We needed to actually come together and formulate that again, because the years before have already been pretty tough. And as you're all very aware, it keeps getting tougher. When I got involved with Jewish student life around 5-6 years ago, things still looked quite differently. I thought being an active Jewish student meant, addressing what was happening in Darfur. It meant organizing get-togethers for young Jews in Europe so that they could feel proud and positive about being Jewish. That's what I thought I was getting myself into. But in the years from then on, it's been a different story. If I just think back in 2012, if some of you remember, has also been quite a defining year for the Jewish community in Europe. There are 2 very significant events, both very different to each other, but very, very significant for the Jewish community. The first one was the attack in Toulouse, the Jewish school in the south of France. And the second one was a court ruling in Germany, in Cologne, on circumcision, ritual circumcision. Talk about existential crisis. On one hand, you have physical security, on the other, your spiritual practice, both under attack within a couple of months of each other. And as student activists, it's quite daunting to even start to talk about that. Well, 2013, 2014, not much easier either. Last year, in 2014, we saw reflected in the European Parliament elections a rise of extreme right populist parties. We had an attack in Brussels on the Jewish Museum. Brussels is a city I live in. I was in Brussels then. One of the consequences, just like any other Jewish office or institution in Belgium, we had to leave the office for a couple of weeks. We had to up the security. And of course, also last summer, we had very ugly scenes in response to the war between Israel and Hamas, where kill the Jews, death to the Jews, all these things that we kind of got used to seeing on the internet was there on our streets. So some of you who have known me for a while know that I always speak about the amazing things about Jewish life in Europe. I speak about the incredible revival, the fascinating projects, the vibrant communities I know, and that still is there. But it's very, very difficult in the face of what we're experiencing right now to keep that balance, to keep that in mind. And this is where I get very concerned for my peers, for the 200,000 Jewish students I represent. So I look at them, and I really do wonder, are we really part of these societies? Are they standing up for us the way they would stand up for other members of their societies? Do they understand what's happening to us? And that's very strange. These are our homes, these are our societies. I'm a citizen of my country. I didn't quite think I would get to this point where I feel not quite so sure about their support and solidarity. And I wonder where we're going to go. But what I do want to say is that the concern for Europe runs much, much deeper than only for the Jewish community. I'm very worried about Europe in a broad sense. I think something is really rotting in Europe. And if the world, if European leadership, be it political, be it other forms of leadership, doesn't come together now in a decisive way, I really don't know what's going to happen. And it's very strange, 70 years after the Holocaust, to actually wonder if this whole project of a European Union, a Council of Europe, all these declarations and institutions that were created in the wake of the Holocaust, in the wake of the Second World War, to prevent that from ever happening again. 70 years later, the project, it's difficult. My opinion and my feelings keep shifting and changing on this. As you can imagine, it's also not something that's analyzed in an evening, understood in an evening, and who knows what the future will hold. I see some positive signs, not only a few. I know there are a lot of people out there who understand that what's happening right now in Europe is quite a big canary in the coal mine. And they see the warning signs. French Prime Minister Manuel Valls' speech is one of the examples of a leader that has fully understood what it means for Europe if Europe's Jews are leaving. I think I will end my remarks here because I would really like to also receive your questions and respond to your questions. And that will leave me to hand over to David. And I thank you again for coming to meet me, to meet with us, to come together as a community, because I think in the face of what is happening, community is the real source of strength and of positivity, because we all know that within these walls, we know that Jewish life is so much more and so much richer and so much better. So, thank you.
It's very painful, I'm sure for you, it certainly is for me, to not only listen to Jane, but to think about the situation that she's now confronted with, together with the 200,000 Jewish students in Europe that she and her organization, the European Union of Jewish Students, represents. It's not the way it was meant to be. They're our children. And the goal of our lives was to ensure that our children, collectively speaking, our Jewish children, would live safer, more secure, richer, deeper Jewish lives even than we were able to do. But they're confronted with a challenge, as are we, but we're talking about the present, and they're also considering their future. It's very, very painful. And by the way, it was 2 weeks ago that I was asked to speak at Shaarei Tefillah in Bedford Corners to a group of 125 or 150 college students between semesters who were increasingly finding on their campuses in this country, campuses that you and I know well, that we graduated from, that we contribute to, that we support in the NCAA sports craziness, that on those campuses they too are beginning to confront serious challenges, both as Jews and as friends of Israel. So my main concern here tonight is not simply as the director of AJC, as Scott Richmond's colleague on a daily basis. My concern is what we need to do in order to ensure Jane's future, wherever she chooses to live her future, the future of the EUJS constituency, Jane, and the future of those children whom I saw up in Bedford some 2 weeks ago. That's our job. So it seems to me, if you'll allow me, that this meeting is actually only the start of something, not the end of something. Coming here tonight is extremely important as an expression of solidarity, of community, of concern. But if we leave here this evening and nothing changes in our lives tomorrow morning, then I submit that we will have failed in the exercise here tonight. We need to be and do different tomorrow because we have an obligation, because we have borne witness to what they are confronting, they, the generation of the children of many of us. So I come here in mourning, as you do, to share in the mourner's Kaddish, in the Psalms, absolutely, to reflect on those whose lives were cut short, you bet. But I come here as well in anger, in deep, unadulterated anger. I come here in anger because this didn't have to happen. Because for the last 15 years, I personally bore witness in hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of meetings that AJC alone had with virtually every European leader. You name the country, I'll tell you the stories of how we tried again and again and again to wake up a sleeping Europe. A Europe that to a very large degree in 2000, in 2001, in 2002, when anti-Semitism broke out, and we saw it, and others experienced it, we were told, you don't understand. We know our countries better than you do. This is not anti-Semitism. This is criminality. This is hooliganism. Or this is a regrettable importation of the Middle East conflict, as if that rationalization could somehow justify violence against Jews. Again and again, we made the case as effectively, as sensitively, as thoughtfully as we could, and too often, people just didn't want to hear it. They thought that these were stealth talking points from the pro-Israel community. They weren't. I love Europe. I spent a good part of my life in Europe. My mother and my father are both from Europe. The cover of this book on French Jews during the war includes the photograph of my cousin Mila Racine in the French Jewish resistance, and my cousin Lily Racine, then a baby. This was my family. Europe was their home. We spoke French at home with my mother and father. My wife has an Italian passport. My 3 children are Italian citizens as well. We have a profound stake in Europe, personally, institutionally, geopolitically. We need Europe to succeed and not fail. And our messages in each and every one of those meetings was, we come as Europhiles, not Europhobes. We need you to succeed. But you won't succeed by wishing to succeed and closing your eyes at the same time. Open your eyes. Stand up and defend core European values. Be proud of what you've achieved since the Second World War. You created in the European Union the most ambitious and successful peace project in modern history. The idea of war between France and Germany is unthinkable. That's what Europe achieved. And Europe achieved a high level of human development and human dignity and human freedom and human rights. And all of that is now under challenge because Europe chose to close its eyes for too long, to believe there was no problem, or if there was a problem, it could be generalized, or maybe it would solve itself. But problems of this massive scale don't solve themselves. And we were angry because this had a name. It was called anti-Semitism. And if any continent in the world should know what anti-Semitism looks like, surely it's Europe. And the anti-Semites also had names. And they also had ideologies and worldviews. And to pretend otherwise was simply to be foolish and short-sighted. And one of those names, and the fact that we even have to debate and discuss whether to utter the name in today's world itself speaks volumes, is called Radical Islam, spelled R-A-D-I-C-A-L-I-S-L-A-M. Why is it so difficult for some to pronounce it, much less to spell it? Our enemies in Europe and elsewhere invoke their religion, invoke their faith in order to justify their deeds. Perhaps we insult them by pretending that they are not, in fact, invoking their name and their religion, at least their interpretation of their religion, those who espouse radical Islam. A few weeks ago, with an AJC group, we were in Germany, meeting with a senior and very respected cabinet official. And at a certain point, the conversation turned to Iraq and Syria, principally because we've been blowing the whistle for so long, saying, watch these guys going, and watch what happens when they come back to Europe. And we mentioned Islamic State as the recruiter. And this cabinet official interrupted us to say, we don't use the term. Why? Because they're not Islamic. This is the debate in the midst of all we're witnessing that we had to have just a few weeks ago in Berlin. Is the Islamic State self-named, in fact, Islamic? Well, they believe they are. So who am I to say they're not? By the way, without wishing to draw a parallel of scale and magnitude, but nonetheless, we have some extremists. How about the one who killed Yitzhak Rabin? Could we simply look at a camera and tell the media, he's not Jewish? What do you mean he's not Jewish? He sees himself as a Jew. He came to his hatred for Rabin through his own involvement in Jewish study and ritual. It's not our interpretation in the sanctuary of what being Jewish ought to be, but we can no more dismiss Yigal Amir or Baruch Goldstein and simply declare as if it were so simple, but they're not Jewish. It has a name, and it's time we grapple with and understand the name. And there are other names. European Jews increasingly, I'm sorry to say, are caught in a pincer movement. On the one hand, from within the growing Muslim population, even if it's only 1% of some 20 to 30 million Muslims today in Europe, we're talking about 200 to 300,000 people. And that assumes it's 1% who either believe in this radical Islamic ideology or support it in some way. A lot of people. We saw what 19 people could do on September 11th, not far from this sanctuary, much less what 1% of 20 or 30 million could do. And then, in part as reaction to this growing migration, and in part as reaction to the economic malaise that Jane spoke about, the extreme right has now emerged as a strong force in several European countries, in some cases even employing Nazi symbols. Take, for example, the Golden Dawn in Greece. Openly, unabashedly using Nazi symbols. And then the third part of the pincer movement is the elegant, intellectual, extreme left, and sometimes not so extreme left, for whom Israel and anyone who dares to support Israel, by definition, ought to be a pariah. BDS for the companies, pariah status for the individuals. So how to be today a public Jew? How to be today the president of the European Union of Jewish Students or of any other Jewish body in Europe? If you stand tall and proud as a Jew, if you stand tall and proud as a friend of Israel, and if you stand tall and proud against all forms of extremism. Today, to be a public Jew in Europe, I say with sadness, is an act of courage. The things that we take for granted are no longer taken for granted in quite the same way by more and more Jews, especially in Western Europe. And how can we live with that notion? The things that we still thankfully take for granted in this country. Sending our children, if we wish, to a Jewish school. Coming to this sanctuary. Going to a kosher supermarket. Visiting a Jewish museum. All of those things in recent months and years in Europe have triggered violence and even death, as we've witnessed. So our argument to Europe, which is now at long last waking up, is now that you've figured it out, now that you understand there is something called anti-Semitism, and it's specific, and it chooses its targets carefully, we're here to tell you something else. Anti-Semitism is not about Jews alone. This is not a proprietary Jewish issue. Anti-Semitism is a cancer that, left unchecked, will metastasize and ultimately damage, if not destroy, European democracy and pluralism. Everything that Europe, to its great credit, built up, from the original 6 countries to now 28, is at risk. What Manuel Valls, the French Prime Minister whom Jane mentioned, said is absolutely right. France will no longer be France if the Jews of France vote with their feet. How could it be? How could the country of liberty, fraternity, and equality, how could the country of Voltaire, how could the country of Léon Blum and Pierre Mendès France, how can that country be France if the Jews of France no longer believe the state can protect them? Not that the state doesn't want to protect them, let's be clear. The fundamental difference between the 1930s and now is that then we were dealing with anti-Semitic governments. Today we're dealing with governments in Europe that fight anti-Semitism. Late in the day, inadequately, clumsily perhaps, but they get it. They're with us, not against us. And increasingly they're understanding that the stakes involve not just the Jews who choose to make Aliyah or who choose to come to Miami or Montreal. It's about Europe's very future, which means that Europe has as much of a stake in the outcome of what we're discussing here tonight as we do. And I'm angry because too many in Europe still, and not just in Europe, by the way, refuse to understand what's staring them in the face. What they're facing is what Israel has faced. This attempt by too many in Europe to separate. No, these are our terrorists. Israel's terrorists are a different breed. And on they go still at the United Nations endorsing anti-Israel declarations and resolutions, failing to grasp that Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the ISIS that's just around the corner from Israel and Jordan is part of the same family tree as the jihadist theology and ideology that struck in France, that threatened in Belgium, and that threatened elsewhere. Why can't they make the connection? Why can't they grasp that Israel, as a democratic and pluralistic nation, is grappling with the same kind of mindset, the all-or-nothing mindset, this notion of us against the infidel? To be sure, Israel's situation is complicated, and not all of its enemies brandish the Islamic flag. But nonetheless, this inability or unwillingness to link the two must be infuriating and must be countered. And finally, as Scott said, this is an evening, I hope, not just about trying to describe a situation. All of us here need to work together to find a prescription. When I think, for example, about the power in this sanctuary, I know some of you, but I look at the 500 or more people who are here tonight, and I can only begin to imagine the resources, the assets, the skills, the talents that this room has. If we could somehow harness it and mobilize it, what kind of a force would we become in defense of the future of Jewish students and young people in Europe or here or elsewhere? Some people say, well, what can I do? And the answer is each of us can do something, and something more than we're currently doing. We have friends and potential friends. We're not alone. Slowly, too slowly for my taste, people are waking up, as I mentioned, and realizing this is not just about the Jews. You know, when Islamic State, with all due respect to the cabinet official in Germany, arrived in Iraq, there were no Jews. The Jews of Iraq had all been rescued by Israel in the early 1950s. But that wasn't the end of the game for them, was it? They looked for the Yazidis. They looked for the Christians. They looked for Muslims of other beliefs than their own radical views. It brought to mind for me Pastor Niemöller's notion about the Holocaust and the Second World War. When they finally came for me, there was no one left to stand with me. We have to help the world understand that this is a collective battle for the core values of democracy and pluralism and mutual understanding, which have made Europe and the United States and the other great democracies what they are. We shouldn't be in this alone. Coalition building becomes essential. We need to ensure that the Jews of Europe, and especially in countries like France and Belgium, also never feel alone. And we need to be sure that all of our officials in the United States, of whatever party, local, state, national, executive, legislative, all grasp that there's more that they can do, that we can do together. We've got to make this a collective priority. I've said before, some of you have heard, that I believe this is a defining moment. It's a defining moment in world history. If we get the encounter between Islam and modernity in Europe wrong, the consequences will be felt not for days, but for decades. If we get the Iran issue wrong, and it is on the verge of nuclear capability, the consequences are not days, but decades. If we cannot reassert strong, determined, focused American global leadership, the consequences of that failure would be measured again not in days, but in decades. And if we can't stand up for the one democracy in the Middle East that has tried with all its might, not just to defend itself, but to entrench true democracy, respect for human dignity in a part of the world which barely knows what those terms mean, then we have failed. This is a defining moment, ladies and gentlemen. And that means it's a defining moment not just there, it's a defining moment here, within each of us. How are we going to react to this situation? Again, what are we going to do differently? It's a time, I believe, to say, each of us, Hineni, here I am, and collectively to say, Hinenu, here we are. At AJC, whether in Westchester or around the world, this is exactly what we're seeking to do. Collectively, in the smartest way we know, to say Hinenu, to engage world leaders, to engage national leaders, to engage local leaders, civic and political, and to help them understand the stakes involved in getting it right. Again, in my wildest dreams, I would see all 500 of you mobilized, angry, but taking that anger and channeling it constructively to engage the world in a way that says, at the end of the day, we have fulfilled our pledge to Jane's generation, to our children's generation. They will live as proud Jews and secure Jews because we helped achieve that for them. Thank you and good night.
Well, the question of should the Jews leave France, yeah, very aware of it. And it's a difficult one because who says that? Who addresses the French community? Who is the French community also? From my point of view, I think more energy needs to be put in fighting against the fact that Jews feel that their life is so insufferable in France that they have to leave. That's what needs to be fought. I I understand, I mean, all of us have thrown up our hands in the air and said, this is it. I mean, what else can we do? Like, how can you send your kids to school that is not only protected by police at this stage, but by the army? I mean, how can you live that way? But I think it's more constructive to channel the energy towards, well, what needs to happen so that this will end? And I think I'll leave that there.
We know, all of us, that not all Muslims by any stretch share the ideology of Islamic State or al-Nusra or Islamic Jihad or al-Qaeda. Go down the list. And they're not all ready to take young boys and train them to behead in Iraq, as we've seen. But this is not just our defining moment, it's their defining moment. If they don't stand up now, organize effectively, and speak for what we hope is the silent majority, then our efforts will be, by definition, limited in impact. I would urge all of you, if you haven't already done so, to read the speech of Egyptian President al-Sisi at Al-Azhar University, which is the great Islamic University of Cairo. It's a remarkable speech, and I'm surprised it didn't get more media attention. But you will find it on AJC's Facebook page, AJC Global. You'll also find 116,000 people who've already gone to the page. So please join them if you haven't. But read the speech. And hopefully the speech of President al-Sisi and others like him will begin to galvanize. What he said, and I'm paraphrasing, is he spoke to the clergy, to the imams, and he said, we need a revolution. You're bringing us down. Bring us up. Lift us up. Stop destroying and start building. Those are the kinds of messages we need to hear around the world. And just one last thought. An AJC group was in Indonesia in October. Indonesia, as you may know, is the largest Muslim majority nation in the world. And they just ushered in a new government. And one of our central messages on our visit was, you are the world's largest Muslim majority nation. You have established a strongly rooted democracy here in Indonesia. And by and large, pluralism here works well. You need to take the lead. You need to regain the position of leadership within the Muslim world and take it away from the radicals who are hijacking your faith. It's their struggle as much as it's our struggle. Indeed, I would say it's even more. On the question about hate speech, look, this is a very tricky one. And I know there's a camera, so I will nonetheless be honest. Here, we strongly stand with and defend the First Amendment. It's a core principle of our American society. And there have been times when all of us have been offended by other people's exercise of the First Amendment. But we have learned that the response to that is our own peaceful response, and not a violent response. And by the way, in that spirit, I want you to know that AJC was the first, and to the best of my knowledge, the only Jewish or non-Jewish organization in the world that in 2005 traveled to Denmark to stand with Denmark after the onslaught of burnings of Danish embassies and flags around the world because of those cartoons. Now, please understand me. Had we been the editors of that Danish newspaper, I very much doubt we would have published the cartoons. Not because we didn't have the right to, because we are not in the business of gratuitous offense to other people's faiths. So we would not have published those cartoons. But once there was the attack on Denmark, on its embassies and on its flags, we felt there was an even higher value at stake here. And so we went to Denmark and we looked over our right and left shoulders and we were alone. No one came at the same time, no one came afterwards. Denmark was left alone. And boy, if you're looking for hypocrisy, the very same protesters then, and by the way, now, whether in Niger or in Russia or elsewhere that we read about, have absolutely no hesitation to read media that vilifies, demonizes, caricatures, lampoons Judaism and Christianity. They've made an art form of it in much of the Arab world, and that's fine for them. Only one religion is meant to be off limits to the cartoonists and caricaturists and perhaps cynics. So we felt there was a higher principle even than what we deemed offensive cartoons. On freedom of speech, Europe has different rules than we do. And we don't challenge their rules. To the contrary, where they have rules, enforce them. There are a number of European countries, for example, that have what they call the Auschwitz lie law. It is against the law to deny the Shoah. Now here, anyone can stand up and deny the Shoah till kingdom come and nothing will happen to them. But there are a number of European countries. Is Switzerland one? I think Switzerland, where Jane is from, is one. But there are at least 8 or 9. So they have different laws than we do. We don't challenge those laws, enforce them, for goodness sakes. Final, historical irony. AJC, since 1950, was out there first trying to engage Germany after the war. A very complicated story, but I think ultimately the right story. And I can recount meetings with one German chancellor after another where they pleaded with us, AJC, the Jewish organization, please go back and do something about your First Amendment. It's killing us. Why? Because Nazism is banned in Germany. Nazi symbols are banned. The swastika is banned. But if you have a server in Nebraska or in Kansas or elsewhere in the United States that publishes material in German for a German audience, it's protected. And you can't stop someone sitting in their home in Dresden or Berlin or Frankfurt from accessing those websites, which are geared towards German-speaking audiences in Germany. And here we were, the Jewish organization, saying to Chancellor Kohl and Chancellor Schroeder and Chancellor Merkel, we'd love to help you, we can't. But we're trying to deal with a neo-Nazi problem in Germany that's being supported from this country, the United States.
So maybe I should start off with also explaining a bit of the differences in European Jewish student life. Obviously, you're all aware that Europe is a very diverse place. France is not Poland, is not Sweden, is not Switzerland, is not Italy, is not Spain, is not Macedonia. It's very, very different from country to country. And I think this is also very important to remember when we're discussing anti-Semitism, that the image and the specific issues, dangers, threats are also different from country to country. Student life is also organized differently. It's not, in majority, it's not a campus-based student life the way you know it here in the US. The big exception being the UK, which has campus-based university life. But in other places, students don't live on campus. It's a much more permeable experience where you live in an apartment here, you have your friends there, and then you go to a lecture at university. So this bubble environment of campus life, it doesn't quite apply to the European context. That being said, it makes it somewhat easier to also avoid the problems on campus. Universities in Europe are also, similarly to here in the US, political. I mean, you get a bunch of young people together that are stretching their intellectual wings, learning all kinds of new things and debating heatedly. So yeah, campus life is, where you can call it campus life, it is a problematic place. And what we've seen is that more and more young Jews make their Jewishness, their Jewish identity, a private matter. Explaining to somebody that you're Jewish in Europe is somewhat of a loaded thing, unfortunately. Not always negative, but it just always comes with a lot of baggage. It's not something you just say lightheartedly and people are like, oh, okay, cool. It was actually one of the things that really struck me when I first spent some time here in the US, where I was so used to, you know, these reactions when people learned that I was Jewish. I almost missed it. I was like, oh, don't you want to know more? Isn't this the first time you're meeting a Jew? Like, isn't this a bigger deal? Well, in Europe it is, and more, I think we see young Jews disengaging from Jewish student life. Getting active is seen as a very intense commitment that many young people are just not willing or able to take on. Because if you become a Jewish student activist in Europe, then you're in it 100%. A, because it's a public thing. B, because you're dealing with anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, very heavy stuff, and it takes up quite a lot of room very quickly, and not all young Jews are up for that. So for a lot of our member organizations, even if they're not campus-based, they're having more and more trouble getting young Jews involved with what they're doing, and this is very concerning. Because if being a young Jew in Europe is either some sort of private club matter or, you know, a full-out, on the barricades, 100% 24/7 activist role, we're not going to have a lot of people engaging with this. It's very difficult. I mean, I can speak in terms of anecdotes. Nobody has done surveys, which actually I think would be very helpful in understanding the reality in Europe. But we don't have surveys. We don't have a real understanding of what's going on across the board. I just know from conversations I've had with people, kind of punctual in specific ways, how young Jews are feeling. And yeah, I do think there is a trend of at least confining Judaism to a very small space in their lives, certainly not a public one. And this is something where we really also see what fear does to a community, like the very widespread effects and consequences it has. And it's really something we try to combat very, very hard. We put a lot of energy in at EUJS and my organization. We really want young Jews to first and foremost also feel that it's good to be a Jew. On our office, we scrawled in very, very big letters, "It's a joy to be a Jew." And actually, in 2014 at the Global Forum, the AJC Global Forum, Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs said, "Less oi, more joy," which is also one of the mottos we've put on our walls. So we try to really live by that, and we try to get as much support for that as we can. Regarding also the relationships with students from other communities, Muslim-Jewish dialogue has actually started with student groups in Europe. It was not the established community. It was not the established European Jewish organizations. It was the students that kind of pushed that forward, that said, let's face it, the tensions are with young Muslims. I certainly don't have a lot of issues with, a Protestant colleague. Things get touchy when I discuss with my Muslim colleague. And so a lot of student unions have local projects in interfaith dialogue. In certain parts of Europe where there's no Muslim community, and we often say Europe and we mean Western Europe, and I myself also try to remind myself Europe is also a much, much bigger place, and there are many countries in Europe where you don't have the problem with radical Islam. But in Hungary, for example, Jewish students work a lot with the Roma, with the Gypsy community. So we all know that fighting anti-Semitism, fighting actually all of the diseases that Europe currently has, it's certainly not going to happen if each community tries to solve it on its own. If there's one thing we've really learned from our American friends, is that alliance building is the absolute key to addressing any of this. And we're trying to import that also on the student level.
On the first question of American leadership, the issue is the perception. And in all of our travels around the world, there is a perception, fair or unfair, that America has taken a step backward in its engagement. In some respects understandable after the experiences in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and a desire to pull back and not to too quickly re-engage in yet another conflict situation in the Middle East, in part because, thankfully, hallelujah, after 40 years we're finally getting it right and on the verge of energy independence as a nation, which is going to be an enormous factor geopolitically and economically, but may also at the same time give us slightly less interest in the oil-producing regions in the Middle East, for example. So this question of the perception of American leadership becomes extremely important, because I'm one who believes very much that with all the mistakes that this country has made, and we've made our share, and each of us can probably list a few, America is the greatest force for good on the face of the earth. And if there is a perceived vacuum, who is going to fill it? Well, the answer is in. The answer begins with a gentleman in Moscow. He believed there was a vacuum, and look what he did. And I can only imagine that if leaders in Pyongyang and Tehran and Caracas and elsewhere believe there's a vacuum, they're going to be still more mischievous. And what China decides to do is perhaps the central question geopolitically of the 21st century, vis-a-vis the United States and vice versa. So very big questions. On the media, it's very hard to talk about the media. Just as Jane said, it's very hard to talk about Europe. But by and large, if we have one complaint about the media, and some of us read much of the European media, it's the vilification of Israel, which we see again and again and again in the form of headlines, placement of articles, leads, captions, cartoons, editorials, you name it. And this constant attempt to demonize Israel or portray it as the villain in the Middle East story has its effect. It has its effect on the image of Israel, and it has its effect on those in Europe who are themselves supporters of Israel, who by extension then become supporters of whatever Israeli policy is being vilified in the media. So, yes, the media could do a better job, I think, of keeping to the facts to the extent that they can. And the last thing I want to say before we close is to remind us, or to share one story that you know and another story you may not know. The story you know is about the young man in the kosher meat market who saved the lives of several people at obvious risk to his own life. That should be a reminder to all of us that this is not, should not, must never become the civilizational war that Professor Samuel Huntington of Harvard predicted might one day be the case. The war takes place within civilizations, first and foremost, rather than between. It's the war within Islam. It's the war between people like that young man, for whom the Jews were other human beings that were worthy of being saved, even at risk to his own life. Very much in the spirit of the Jan Karskis of the world, of Le Chambon-Soulignon, of the Chasidei Umot HaOlam, the righteous among the Gentiles, who saw in the other the image of God and who acted accordingly. We need to remember that. And I want to add one story you may not know because it reinforces it for me, and it always has. In 1967, a 16-year-old girl and her 7 siblings and parents living in Tripoli, Libya, were surrounded by a raging mob of 200 to 300 people who wanted to burn down their modest house. For one simple reason: they were Jews. The 16-year-old girl was my future wife. There was one man in the crowd, though, who had the courage to stand up and say, "Leave them alone. Don't do it." And miraculously, the crowd backed off. And he took those 10 people, 8 children and 2 adults, into hiding for 3 weeks, until safe passage was arranged for that family to leave Libya, its ancestral home, and move to Italy, which is where I met my wife. That gentleman was a Libyan, an Arab, and a Muslim. He saved the lives of 10 Jews. As long as there are people like that, and like the young man in Paris who saved the lives of several Jews at the kosher supermarket, we need to be extremely nuanced in understanding who our friends are, who our potential friends are, and yes, who our adversaries are. So let me close, though, on one challenging note. The problem is that the person who saved my wife's family has begged the family not to reveal who it is to this day. Unlike the Chasidei Umot HaOlam at Yad Vashem, this name is not known and will never be known, because this person fears that if the name is known, that there will be those who say, "You saved 10 Jews, you know what happens to you." The day that saving 10 Jews in Muslim society, broadly speaking, or saving 10 Muslims in Jewish society becomes the norm rather than the exception, is the day perhaps that we will have fulfilled the prophetic vision. That's AJC's mission. Please join us.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Gem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.